Sagoli Sogwik, Layungwilagehte Niungyuts, or Nicholas Metoxen is my name. I'm from Oneida Cultural Heritage, and today I just wanted to explore a question that we're often asked by surrounding school districts to come in and clear up or talk about or educate about, and that is, do schools have the authority to restrict use of traditional tobacco use on school grounds? So, for background, I wanted to talk about some of the key distinctions between commercial and traditional tobacco. And so there is a scientific difference in the strain that each of them come from. Nicotiana tabacum is what was typically used in what we call commercial tobacco, such as chews, cigarettes, cigars, and things of that sort. Versus Nicotiana rustica is the variety that a lot of different nations use as their traditional ceremonial tobacco. There's some chemical differences, such as nicotine levels, smoothness of smoking, and things of that sort. But typically, Nicotiana rustica, for the most part, isn't smoked in the same ways that our commercial tobacco or Nicotiana tabacum is smoked. Um, and Nicotiana rustica goes back for a really long time for some of the communities here. And we can speak about Oneida's relation to our native tobacco, not necessarily from a Native American standpoint in general, but for us, that traditional tobacco goes all the way back to our creation story. We have stories of Sky Woman's daughter um, dying during childbirth, and when she's buried, this is one of the plants that comes from her mind. So even in her passing, that's a gift given to us. And then we're reminded again in later stories in Galileo or Good Message that talk about this tobacco being a gift to us to send those messages and offer prayers. So it has a lot of significance to us culturally. You'll see a lot of people wearing them in tobacco pouches around their necks, or having tobacco ties as gifts or things like that. Um, and there is, an occasional time when it is ignited or smoked as well. So, looking at some of the legal aspects of the question at hand here, the first thing I wanted to talk about is the Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. Prior to this act in 1978, essentially, and for all intents and purposes, it was illegal to practice our traditional religions, our traditional ways and values. And it was outlawed and persecuted for over 100 years, 200 years prior to this being there. And that's not to say after 1978 everything was perfect, but that was where we were able to start practicing our ways, and we're still in a rebuilding period as a result of that act in 1978. Um, and basically, what that allowed us to do is we had federal protections that prevented people from, outlawing or blocking our religion from being expressed in a lot of different ways. And one key aspect that I wanted to talk about with this one is a specific court case where um, that we have listed here, the Native American Council of Tribes versus Weber in 2012. Uh, and so we don't have any specific school-related examples where this act was used to back up claims, that would affirm students' rights to carry their traditional tobacco or use traditional tobacco on school grounds. But the next closest thing is this particular case here that I had just mentioned. And essentially, this was the Council of Tribes taking legal action against Douglas Weber, as well as the Dakota State Penitentiary and the Secretary of the Department of Corrections. So Douglas Weber was the warden of the South Dakota State Penitentiary at the time. And for a little background, they at one point in time were allowing tobacco use and cigarette use in their penitentiaries. And those policies got tighter and tighter as time went on because of whatever problems were going on. But it reached a point where they moved to a full ban on tobacco products in their penitentiaries for South Dakota. And as a result of that one, Native populations thought that this was an infringement on their rights and religious freedoms, and referenced the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of '78 in their argument. They argued that, you know, banning tobacco across the board infringes on their rights. And even if they were to ban commercial tobacco, that traditional tobacco should not be included in that. And essentially, this provided a lot of groundwork for our question today. They upheld that they have a right to exercise their freedom, including use of tobacco for ceremonial or traditional practices. And to this day here at Cultural Heritage, we still get requests for people coming in, requesting us to come in and assist with different ceremonies and education and different, activities that will help meet the needs of the native populations in penitentiary systems, because this case really, although it was specific to the Department of Corrections of South Dakota, when a precedent is set like that in a court case, you tend to see that reflected across the country. So even here in Wisconsin, we see the results of this court case. And so now I want to kind of move into talking about school-specific legislation that relates to our question at hand here. And like I said, there's been no precedent set for schools that is being followed across the country here, but we do have at a state level individual statutes when we look around the country that talk about this issue here. And so the first one I wanted to point out here is Minnesota State Statute 144.4165. And at first glance, this looks like a pretty typical anti-tobacco, tobacco-free school policy. And this is one that they have for public schools statewide. But when we look at Section B here, we have a very specific protection that's included in this statute that says, hey, everything about our tobacco-free policy does not reference cultural tobacco, or cultural tobacco isn't included in that. So we have, this section that talks about carrying and igniting by an adult, being protected by the same act that's prohibiting commercial tobacco use in school grounds in Minnesota here. And so that's a really good example of a state that has taken action regardless of legal precedent being set to say, hey, we as a state, we are going to back that in our public schools. Unfortunately, when we look at Wisconsin, we're a little bit more of the Wild West when it comes to this particular subject here. And so what I've done is I've pulled a couple of the code of conduct policies or tobacco-free school policies from a couple of overlapping and bordering school districts here with the Oneida Reservation in Wisconsin. And so West Lapeer, which is my alma mater, we have a very typical tobacco policy here, that talks about all other alcohol and illicit drug use being prohibited 365 days a year, no matter what. But at no point is there a distinction made for traditional tobacco use. So next, I want to jump over to the Green Bay Area Public School District and take a look at their code of conduct. They're also another school district that kind of overlaps and is very close to the West Lapeer School District, but we have a much different, tobacco-free policy here. In their code of conduct, they have Section 2, which is exemptions. And A is outlining any medical exemptions that might, allow a student to break the typical tobacco-free policies. And then in B, we have a section here that directly references the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 and acknowledges that students may have a legitimate use for the use of traditional and ceremonial tobacco. And so that's why I kind of said on the last slide that Wisconsin's more of a Wild West without that overarching statute that sets the precedent for the whole state. Or without any, legal foundation like we have for the Department of Corrections, school districts are really left to their own devices to decide whether they want to include it or not. So after reviewing the two different tobacco-free policies for the two districts on the previous slides, it kind of led me to ask another question. What kind of guidance are school districts getting when developing their own policies? So if you go to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction page and look up tobacco-free policy, you get a couple different documents that have some guidance on developing these policies. One of them references Wisconsin State Statute 120.1220 that just outlines the restrictions on tobacco use on school grounds, but it has nothing in there about protections or exemptions for Native American students. And in that checklist, there's a few different sections. One of them is an additional policy provision section. And in that one, it suggests include an exemption that allows for the use of tobacco for indigenous practices. And it's left very open-ended and optional, if that's something you want to include or not. And additionally, if you look at the sample tobacco-free policy on their site, there's nothing there on that draft. That one's more of a insert school district name here and submit for the example that you want to use. And again, there's no mention of Indian Civil Rights Act of '78 or really anything about ceremonial tobacco in that policy. So, like I said, it's just set up to be very open-ended and allow schools to decide, hey, is this something that we want to include, or do we want to just across the board say no tobacco on school grounds? And so this kind of brings us back to our guiding question, our opening question that we ask. Do schools have the authority to restrict the use of traditional tobacco use on school grounds? And the answer is, it depends. It's really not clear. It depends what school district you're in. What do your specific school district policies say? Depends what state you're in. Does your state have a statute mandating protections for traditional tobacco use by Native students? Is it private or public? And so here in Wisconsin, we don't really have a clear yes or no. There's been no legal precedent set. We have Department of Public Instruction guidelines suggesting that it be included, but nothing set in stone saying that there is. And until there's a state statute or a federal statute or more strict guidelines by the Department of Public Instruction, we won't have a clear answer to this question here in Wisconsin. And so what should school administrators do? If they're in the position where they don't have anything on the books right now, which is fine, it happens. Some of these policies were written before a lot of these conversations were even happening. Some of the next steps that you can take are revise and review your school policies. Ask, is this something that's affecting our students in a negative manner? Consult with your local tribes. There's different school districts that are close to certain tribes, and a lot of them, I'm sure, are happy to come in and help provide some guidance or some education on best practices for their kids. And most of all, continue your own personal education. I think that's our role as human beings on this earth, is to continue our education and help us make the best decisions possible. And so I've attached some resources here on this page that might help guide some administrators into the right place. We have our Cultural Heritage website linked here, which also has a button for our service request if you want to work with Oneida Cultural Heritage on any of these questions, as well as a lot of teachers' resources and coloring sheets that have to do with culture. And with Act 31 in Wisconsin being a big thing, that's another question we get often. What kind of resources do we have? So if you go to our site, you'll find a lot of different resources, not just around strictly culture, but incorporating culture into math and sciences and environmental stewardship and things of that sort. And I've also linked the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction outline that I was referring to, that checklist, that goes through and touches on all of the different aspects of, a tobacco-free policy for schools. And so that's my main call to action here is, continue educating yourselves, incorporate this stuff into your curriculum, make sure everyone has an understanding of it, because that's the first step in making the right decision, is making sure that we're informed. And so that's my presentation for today. Yawanko for listening, and look forward to hearing from some of you guys and helping developing some of these policies.